Okay, and I thank everybody for your patience. Our next speaker is Peter Reali. Peter is a board member of the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies. He's a retired electrical design engineer and manager from Silicon Valley. At Silicon Valley, his specialty was in telecommunications, information technologies, where he designed network communication systems, fiber optic ring networks, and timing synchronization. Further, he earned his bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. So, Peter, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the AIAA for having us here today for this, important event. As I said, my name is Peter Reali. I'm with the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, which is, been in existence for a few years now, and we're dedicated to trying to put a scientific basis on understanding these phenomena. So, next slide. Since you've already introduced me, I'll just go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to be talking today about the Nimitz event, which has been covered a little bit already before. The Nimitz event in 2004 is probably one of the best documented cases. It's been, it's 6 pilots and 2 very qualified radar operators who testified that this is a valid event that really happened. So I'll be talking more about them later. Next slide. Okay, so the background on this was there was going to be a naval exercise in 2004 with the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz and its surrounding ships. And these objects had been observed for a few days before the actual exercise by Kevin Day, who's already been mentioned here. He was a chief, he was in charge of the radar. And the objects were descending from 80,000 feet to 28,000, and then from 28 down to the surface, and going very erratic behavior. And there were groups of them. So the exercise was canceled. And, the radar had been calibrated for a few days before. They'd been calibrating it many times. And this is a very advanced radar, SPY-1 radar, phased array radar, very, very state of the art at the time. Next slide. Okay, the methods we used as a forensic analysis, the SCU was investigating this case a year before it came out in the New York Times. And we've interviewed several of the people involved in it. We've done FOIA studies. We also have done a lot of kinematic analysis based on the reported measurements that were taken. And we do a statistical analysis, a null hypothesis, which is, and basically what we're trying to show is try and prove that this is a misidentified conventional object using conventional physics. That's the approach. And if we can't do that, then it has to be anomalous. So next slide. There were 3 basic encounters in this in the Nimitz event. The first encounter was by the radar operators, David Day and Gary Voris, which was we already talked about. The second was when the actual event was canceled, the exercise. They sent out 2 planes. David Fravor was the commander of them, and he actually descended down and got a close-up of the object, and that's where the tic-tac visualization has come from. The third was after they returned to the Nimitz aircraft carrier, they sent up another plane with 2 pilots, and with a Flir camera, which is their video camera. It's an infrared camera, a targeting pod. They actually captured a video of the object. And that was done by, recently came out, the pilot has testified to it, Chad Underwood. Next slide, please. Okay, we use 2 kinematic analysis from basic physics, assuming, as mentioned before, the objects would hover at either high altitude or at sea level. They would then rocket up to the halfway point and then start decreasing their velocity to hover at the other point. And so we assumed two kinematic analysis here, one for a linear velocity, and next slide, the other for a parabolic velocity, because at the center point, the halfway point for the linear velocity, there would be a huge acceleration change. So it was trying to make it, how could we make this so you could do this with a rocket engine in conventional physics? And it turns out that it doesn't make a lot of difference. You trade one thing for another. Next slide. We also calculated the power requirements for this based on conventional Newtonian physics, basically force times velocity. And since we had the calculated velocities and accelerations, and we assume in this case, we don't know the mass of the object. We assume very conservative mass of 1 ton. And whereas like an F-18 airplane, which could have probably been the only other plane that could have been in the vicinity during this exercise because it's a restricted area, weighs 16 tons unfueled. So that we did some kind of advanced conventional technology of 1 ton. Next slide, please. The results were, again, these amazing, unbelievable velocities, accelerations, and power. So because it was said to, it was 0.78 seconds for it to descend, we took a devil's advocate and said, well, what if it's 6 seconds, was mistaken or something like that. The net result is that for the 6 seconds, the most very conservative, is that the velocity was between 16,600 miles per hour and 10,227 miles per hour. For the 0.78 seconds, it was 104,895 miles per hour to 78,409 miles per hour. For the acceleration was for the 6 second was between 204 Gs to 310 Gs. And for the 0.78 seconds, it's 12,250 Gs to 18,385 Gs, depending on, of course, the assumed kinematics of it, assumed, how the thing was accelerating, which we don't know, but we know what the averages are, so we can assume these two different trajectories. The power is just phenomenal. That's to my mind, the most anomalous thing about it is the power, because there's no conservation of energy says this must be released to the atmosphere. Yet the power for the most conservative 6 second case varied between 11.3 gigawatts and 9.75 gigawatts. Now, to put this in perspective, a gigawatt is a good sized nuclear power station. Maybe 1 to 1.5 gigawatts is what they produce. So this would be 11 of them. And for the linear case, it's phenomenal. It's 5,126 gigawatts and 4,440 gigawatts. This is equivalent to about a 1.05 kiloton of TNT being detonated per second, like a small tactical nuclear weapon. Next slide. The conclusions are no human could sustain the calculated 170-pound human would be subjected to a force of 17.6 to 1,041 tons. It would kill anybody. A 6 second parabolic trajectory is equivalent to 2.3 tons of TNT being detonated each second. The 0.78 second parabolic trajectory is equivalent to a 1.05 kiloton tactical nuclear weapon being detonated each second. And again, there was no report of any disturbance in the atmosphere. So the speed at maximum velocity would be equivalent to a meteorite entering the atmosphere from outer space. None of these effects were noticed by the personnel reporting this incident. Next slide, please. Okay, the second incident is one of the most interesting, and that is when David Fravor, commander, he's the commander of a flight wing, squadron, I think, flight is the right term. And that was David Fravor, Jim Slate, and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, and one of their pilot who wishes to remain anonymous. All these people said this happened. They flew out from the exercise off the coast of Baja California in 2004. And when it was canceled, his two planes were sent out to investigate the radar images about 40 miles away from their cap point, which was the cap point is the terminology for where they do their exercise. They they fly against one another and practice. They were going to be heading over to the Middle East for for their deployment. They flew out to 40 miles out, and out at the point, probably hard to see the number there, but at 40 miles out, David Fravor was alerted down below on the water was this white disturbance on the water, and he noticed this object bouncing around. So he decided to descend and keep the other plane up above. He descended down to about 8,000 to 10,000 feet. And at that point, the object, he could see the object was this tubular object, and it sort of noticed him, and it moved out in an opposite direction. So he decided to cross and intercept the object. When he started crossing over to intercept the object shot off, and described as like shot from a gun. So that that there's no timing except shot from a gun, which means usually you can't see it. A few short time later, I'll say, the radar operators said that the object was back at the cap point, so it had traveled 40 miles horizontally and vertically. Also with a vertical altitude probably of 10,000 feet in a very short amount of time. It's seconds, perhaps. Next slide. So this is how it was described. This is from a video by Dave Beatty. It's like I say, it looks something like a natural gas tank with some appendages on the bottom. Next slide, please. Now, shooting out of sight could be due to two things, and we took those into account. One is it shot over the horizon. The second one was visual acuity of the eyesight. Now, good eyesight, you can see 1/60th of a degree, or 1 arc minute. And after that, you can't really begin to recognize it. And also the object was described between 56 to 60 feet long. And what we did is this thing could have been traveling at different angles. So we considered 60 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet, because it could be observed in different aspect ratios. Also, we considered calculations for between very good vision of 1/60th of a degree down to 1/15th of a degree. Next slide. So for the over the horizon, it's very easy to calculate the horizon is at different altitudes. We found that can't be the case because at 10 to 8,000 feet, the horizon is more than 100 miles away, and the object showed up at the 40-mile distance. So next slide. So for the visual acuity, we took all those factors into account using a little bit of trigonometry. We could calculate the the distance and the time required. Since shot from a gun is a little bit nebulous, we calculated for a series of different times: 0.2 seconds, 0.5 seconds, 2.5, and 5 seconds. And I'll talk about 0.5 and 5 seconds. The reason is 0.5 seconds from psychological studies is about the time you can notice, it takes for the brain to notice changes in perception. It's been measured. And 5 seconds is, nobody can really say, 5 seconds probably at the limit that you would say something shot from a gun. So next slide. What we got for that calculation was another more astounding characteristics. For the half second, which is the shot from a gun, the maximum accelerations varied from 83,400 Gs to 3,202 Gs. And for the not shot from a gun, the 5 second one, it varied from 834 Gs to 32 Gs. All of these would destroy an airplane. For the power, maximum power for the shot from a gun was 1.71 times 10 to the 5th gigawatts. And again, I'm assuming we're assuming a 1 ton mass. With weight, but you convert it to mass. And so we get 1.71 times 10 to the 5th gigawatts. And remember, a gigawatt is a nuclear power station. and for the minimum 1,290 gigawatts. For the not for the not shot from a gun, it varies from 171 gigawatts to 1.29 gigawatts, all anomalous. So next slide. So the final conclusions are the blind point distance wasn't determined to be, due to visual acuity. Looking at the acceleration in all cases would be intolerable to human pilots. In most likely cases, any mechanically complicated mechanism would disintegrate due to the excessive forces. Certainly any airplane would not survive. The power dissipated by any known type of heat engine would have caused noticeable, highly visible effects to the negative strike group, due to conservation of energy. That kind of energy has to go somewhere. 5, the only component of velocity and acceleration considered was the horizontal trajectory. In the first case, we considered the vertical, so you'd have to add that as well, so there'd be even more energy. We're just trying to show, do the simple calculations that show the anomalous effect. The null hypothesis event that this event is explained by known objects that were misidentified can't be substantiated. So the objects remain unknown of unknown origin and technology. Next slide, please. The third one is the encounter by Chad Underwood, where he with his Flir camera, his targeting pod, actually, got a video of it. He did not see the object. He was far enough away, but caught it on his Flir camera, and it was doing the same behaviors as described. He has recently come out and done a video and several interviews talking about this. He remained quiet for quite a few years until this all became public, and then he finally came out. And this shows a targeting pod which mounts under the plane on the left. On the right is the screen that the pilots see with the metadata and an example of, we had to study the metadata to understand what the different parts are. A lot of this is not very easy to do because much of this is classified. Further, an important point that is often left out about this is when these objects were viewed, they were using a narrow field of view, which is about 0.7 angular degrees. And this is equivalent to a telescope of about 80, perhaps 80 power, 100 power. So they can see objects miles away. This has been testified with multiple pilots. So next slide, please. Here's an example of what you would see of, these are stealth aircraft, the F-35 and the B-2 bomber. You can see in infrared, they're not invisible. They're invisible radar, or pretty much invisible radar, not perfect, but very hard to detect. And you can clearly see the outlines. You can because as the objects move through the atmosphere, they're heated, and so in this case, white is hotter than the background. And so you can actually see on the left, the F-35, you can see the exhaust coming out of its tail and its characteristics of it. And so, this is with, the infrared characteristics. Next slide, please. Now, this is how we calculated the trajectory based on this. Since on the left is the sensor, or it could also be used like a human eyeball. And we know the field of view of the camera, and we also know the estimated size of the object. So using trigonometry, you can estimate for different distances and the same size object, you can actually estimate the field of view that the object travels through. And on the screen, we divide the object into 12 reticles, 12 divisions. The object takes up a certain amount of space on this, and so you can calculate if you know the timing, which I'll talk about next, you can actually calculate the speed and acceleration. We again use the linear, in this case, we use basically the linear velocity approach because we know the averages, and it's just a convenient way to treat it because we don't know the real trajectory, but it has to be something on this order of magnitude. Next slide.
2 minutes.
Next slide. Okay, in this case, this shows the framing. With the framing, we we can determine the timing of how the object moves through the screen and get the timing for the object. Next slide, please. In this case, we had two things to deal with here. The size of the object viewed on the screen, it has a dense center and then a corona around it. So we had to deal with two sizes, the two diameters. We did calculations for both. The second was a complication. As it moves to the left, the pilot increased the zoom. So during the X2 portion of the screen, the distances have to be halved. And next slide. The net result is these graphs are for what we call early zoom, late zoom. I won't talk about the late zoom because it's really unrealistic. It was done just to emphasize, just to have a sort of a devil's advocate against it. The realistic and most conservative is the early zoom case, and the plane flies at 30 to, the object flies at 30 to 110 Gs. Next slide. In this case, the power requirement, you can calculate the available power of an F-18, which is the only plane possible in the area, and it's also similar to probably even any other kind of advanced jet. And it only had 1 to 34% of the needed power to perform the observed accelerations. The same with the late zoom, even less, 0.8 to 4.5%. So it can't, next slide. Okay, so here's the conclusions. The Tic Tacs are not aircraft of any known type, exhibit technological capability beyond anything that existed in 2004 or that exists today. Tic Tacs exhibit at least one of the following characteristics: no aerodynamic airframe, no obvious means of reactive propulsion, acceleration characteristics beyond human endurance, and airframe structured capability. If the apparent movement of the left is due to vibration of the airplane, well, basically what this is saying is that the only reason you can lose lock is through excessive acceleration to the left. The fourth one is Tic Tacs for a missile. It would be smaller and closer to the plane, and it would not have acceleration calculated in the Flir display as shown above. Next slide. The Tic Tacs were a missile or an airplane. As it moved left, it would have to bank, the plane would bank, and the missile would show its longer edge, and the diameter of the image of the Flir display would move left, and it does not happen. If the Tic Tacs were F-18 size aircraft, it would be between 18 and 33 miles from the Flir camera, and with its telescopic capability, it would be capable of identifying it by its shape, or certainly by the external dimensions of the image on the screen. The size would be able to be calculated, and we'd have shown above. 7, the Tic Tacs demonstrate accelerations greater than 40 Gs and most likely much higher, with no noticeable effect on their structure or performance. Here we are using the early zoom figures from table 1 as the most conservative. 8, the Flir is capable of registering the maximum dimensions of aircraft airframes and showing that the aircraft structures that support lift and maneuver functions none are observed. There's no lift capability. 9, the F-18 does not have adequate power to exhibit even the minimal required acceleration for the maneuvers that are observed in the video. And I think I'll stop here.
All right, Peter, thank you. We have about roughly 3.5 minutes for questions. So please, anyone go ahead and for Peter.
Peter,
sorry. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have a question. It's Philip Iris talking. Peter, just a question. If you would have to ask the military some related data, which ones would you consider studying? The radar data as a first priority or something else?
I had a little trouble understanding what your question is.
I'm sorry. Yeah, if you would, if it would be possible for you to ask the data from the military, what kind of data would be the first objective? Like the radar data would be the most important to study?
What's the most important data to study?
Yes.
Well, we'd like to have the radar. We'd like to have radar, and actually we'd actually like to have, this is only a small part of the videos that were taken, and we'd like to have the whole video, and see, many of these things we only get little snippets of it. And there's, so we'd like to have radar, any kind of RF measurements they have, but basically any of the data, it all's just, we have almost nothing, we have to scrounge around to get anything, and that's basically about all I can say.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, Peter, I was going to be asking you just from the point of view of this, would you consider that in a generic sense, one of your greatest challenges for what you're doing?
Yes, the inability to have the hard data to get, and the not having the data to analyze is very difficult. We have to go to extreme measures, and we have to make assumptions that if we had the data, we wouldn't have to make. And they're good assumptions, but they're not, they're not. They don't really dial into the actually what what's going on. They're very broad, and they just show that things are anomalous. But we'd like to have more detail on this. And it's most of this stuff is classified, but they could be released. This data could be released and scrub the classification part of it and just give us the data. How you got the data is not, details about your instrument and stuff, and it's not so as important. Although perhaps some of the giving away some of this stuff, might reveal some secrets. But this was 2004. This data was 2004, so they've made things advanced quite a bit. So you could, it probably, I'm sure that by this time it's not that classified. But once things get classified, it's very difficult to overcome that.
All right, Peter, thank you. And with that, that'll conclude our first portion of our three speakers that covered the technical characteristics of UAP. We'll engage now into a 10-minute break and then pick up with our next set of speakers, which will be covering the safety implications of UAP. The break will be approximately 10 minutes now, 10 minutes, and we'll be starting now.